All right, guys, let's go ahead and talk about, diplomacy. Most of the countries that had or have a king have the king on their currency. All right, so you look at Thailand's money, they've got the king on there. You look at the UK, they've got the king on there. In effect, the king used to represent a foundation. You can call it a private bank, whatever you want to call it. It's basically a foundation. And it operates essentially as a sleight of hand. So the United States will be known as the shortest empire in the history of the world because it threw off the monarchy. And it didn't have that intermediary, it didn't have that fig leaf of a king to cover up its corporatism. And so you've got these wonderful corporations. You sort of wonder how the United States ended up with so many trillion-dollar companies. It's not a coincidence, right? They're essentially replacing the monarchy. And so when you think of it that way, our king in the United States is the S&P 500. And so let's back up. But the British Empire lasted so long because it had a king that was going out there whose sole purpose was to be friendly, make friends, build relationships, build things, and promote creative people. So when you came under the auspices or the protection of the king, it meant that you had some sort of great talent and you were going to be protected in order to develop that talent. You can see how in the United States, a corporation can do the same thing. Not really, but in a similar way. They can give you protection, they can give you support. The advantage of being a king is that you have these relationships that span centuries. And so you're not, a new corporation that happened to sort of jump on the scene that thinks it can remove history or remake history. There's essentially more arrogance when you're dealing with an empire that's not a monarchy. And so what really ended up happening was we moved from a monarchy into essentially a lawyer-checked, a lawyer-driven republic. In many places that threw off the monarchy, essentially, they allowed, even if they allowed the monarchy, they would still have more of a role for lawyers. And now the deal here is that the king became, in some countries, corrupt, like the Shah had a secret police, and so, that they call the Savak. And so we ended up having a position where, the lawyers were seen as more honest than the king, or at least less corrupt. Well, in the United States, you can see now with the with the pursuit of Donald Trump, with just even low-level litigation that I can attest to, you've got a situation where someone like me has been arrested twice. They dropped the charges twice. I'm a lawyer in California. The charges were so ridiculous that one of them was drug possession. I don't even drink alcohol. So if this can happen to a lawyer in California, there's no doubt that the lawyers, despite all these supposed checks and balances, have failed. So what's happening now is we're going back to the monarchy, but instead of kings, we have billionaires. And instead of one king, you have many kings. You've got all these billionaires coming in, not just one. And so the idea is in the new United States, which is now essentially an American monarchy, rather than a verifiable, or I suppose a constitutional republic that's based on integrity. We don't have that anymore. And so if we're going back to a monarchy, do we have the diplomatic skills as a younger country to make it work? And we don't. And so that's why I think that, we're going to have quite a few problems in the United States. What helped the British last so long was that the king would be usually part of from the people themselves. And so you take somebody, you're backing him or her up. You do this in Yogyakarta in Indonesia. You separate families, the brothers within the families from each other in Indonesia. There's even a mansion. You go down there, and there's got a picture, a portrait of Princess Diana right there. And the house is still there today. It was untouched. That's the power of money. But it's also the power of respect, because the banks probably were looted, right? When the Dutch took their money out, or when they blamed the Chinese and so on and so forth. But that house is still there because it had, again, probably a history of building relationships. So it was able to give itself more than just money, right, which comes and goes. And so the secret to the British Empire lasting so long was not only an effective navy, but also this idea that while you're taking somebody else's natural resources, maybe starving the Bengalis and so on, it's hard to see that if you've got the king being given to you in every newspaper and every television and every radio all over the world. It's going to be really hard to break through all that information. If you've got 10 different things and the king is doing 10 good things, it's hard to get that story about a starvation or about a mass shooting anywhere. And so that's the secret, is that it's really hard to have a revolution if the king is really, especially if the king is one of you, even though he's propped up like a puppet, like the Shah of Iran, for example, right? If he's propped up, right, then, it's really hard to see all the way down just based on the way the human mind, operates. And so the Americans don't have that king, right? We have billionaires. And so we have to, we don't have that sort of relationship. So I don't think the United States is going to be successful, for much longer. Certainly not in a way, that would allow any sort of principled approach. It will be successful in a corporate manner. It will make good products. Manufacturing will be great. Again, in Germany, right, we still wear Adidas shoes. The AD stands for Adolf, not the Adolf with an H, but another one. It was a very popular name, first name. The Volkswagen is basically, again, another manufacturing miracle of the National Socialists. We're still using that today. And again, to give you an idea of just how good these private banks or these banks have become at convincing us that, night is day and day is night. The Volkswagen is now celebrated with a peace and advertised with a peace symbol. Okay? So if you can go from that to that, it shouldn't give you, too much pause to see how effective you can be when you can not only use that advertising, for a Volkswagen, but you can use that using centuries of good relationships all over the world, right? So anybody says something bad about you, wait a second, you've got this photo, you've got maybe a project. Now China, is going to have a hard time as well because they don't have that monarchy. They decided not to interfere, right? And so, but how do they influence people, right? If they're just going to build things, right, and nothing else, maybe have a few exchange programs. How? I'm not going to focus on cultural exchanges or cultural sort of, I suppose, improvements, overall, so as a policy. Well, how are you going to compete with the Americans, right? Because the Americans are going to be full steam ahead on the same sort of issues, right, with manufacturing technology. You're going to have these two sort of big corporations fighting each other. But of course, the good news is that there's probably not going to be, it's going to be a Cold War. It's not going to be a hot war because, again, corporations don't like wars. They like to carve out different territories, right, and get monopolies on those or licenses and then essentially just, take advantage, I suppose, of smaller nations not able to jump in and compete based on cost and quality and so on and so forth. And so the good news is I don't think we're going to see a hot war anytime between China and the United States. The bad news is there's a whole vacuum of moral leadership that I think is going to be, it's going to give the British an advantage, right? And Thailand an advantage. Places that have kings that still have those foundations, that can say things like a bus crashed in Udon Thani and the king's foundation is taking care of all the medical bills. It's hard not to like, or at least respect, anybody that does something like that. And so the question is, and certainly in Thailand, the king has been massively beneficial to the people of Thailand. There's no question about it. It's one of the reasons why the Thais, maintained their sovereignty, right? In most other countries that didn't have a king that were occupied by the British, their land was essentially taken away. But, if you've got two monarchies, again, same thing, right? You give each other a bit of respect. And again, you carve out your own territories and so on and so forth. So I think history is going to be really interesting, but the way I see it, you've got, in the United States, you really have, and had, right, maybe all over the world, you have essentially, or had a monarchy military system, right? Sometimes in Europe with the Catholic Church behind it, right? Sort of pulling on the monarchy strings. We've had that in the United States basically tried to compete with a lawyer police opposition. That works if it's honest and if it's not completely complex or complicated enough for the average person to go to court and get respect as an individual. I don't think that, like I said, my existence shows my court cases just me, right? They prove that the United States has failed. And so the question at this point becomes, so now what? Now this has failed, and now we're back to this. But in the United States, instead of having a king, we now have billionaires and the military. And we'll see what happens with that.